Welcome to Section 3, Models and Stages of Divorce. Would you be surprised to know that divorce follows many of the same patterns of grief when losing a loved one to death as it does to death? However, this type of grief is often more complicated given that the person has not physically died and continues to exist but goes on without you intimately. This person, though, as you knew them, has died. Now you must rectify the loss of your partner and their continued influence and existence over your life and your children. Certainly, your level of grief is determined by who left who and what occurred in the relationship. Marriages or relationships that end suddenly and without warning seem to be the most traumatic for the parent being left. On the other hand, sometimes divorce is met with relief by both parents if for years there's been extreme conflict. Certainly every divorce is different, and every party brings different factors to the relationship during and after the breakup. The most commonly referred to model of the divorce process is Kubler-Ross's classic grief model from all the way back from 1969. This model is used to compare our response to death as being similar to our response to the loss of a marriage in divorce. And the stages are as follows. And for many of you, this sounds very familiar. So the first stage is denial. So there's shock and disbelief. You can't believe that the marriage is over. You can't believe that this person is leaving. It almost seems like it's unreal. You probably go to sleep or probably can't sleep very well, but then when you finally do and you wake up in the morning, you hope to wake up to a different life. You're hoping that maybe it was all just a dream. Sometimes you may be numb and not even feel anything. It's so devastating that your senses are overridden. The next stage is anger. So this is when you start realizing that it's really over, and you may have discovered some new facts. Maybe your partner had been having an affair, has been moving money, or is telling you that they haven't loved you for a long time, or maybe you've known all these things, or maybe you've been in the relationship and you just knew that it was ending, but you had no idea that as soon as the marriage would end, that you would have so many feelings about it. But you're frustrated and have an outpouring of emotions during this phase. And then the next phase is bargaining. And this is where examining how things may be okay without the person. And this is when I'm working with people and I start hearing them say things to me like maybe I'll be okay, or they start describing what their possible new outlook will be, or how they're going to live their life without this partner, maybe that it will be okay, or they're figuring out how they're going to make money, that they're not going to be alone forever, that their kids are going to be okay. This is when they're bargaining with themselves, where they're starting to process and put the puzzle pieces together that things will be eventually okay for them. And then they move into depression, and this is where you realize that the person is absolutely gone and you're going to be moving on with your life. And despite this being after bargaining, because remember, the bargaining is taking you really to a sense of reality, and moves you into depression, where you start grieving over the loss of the relationship. And then you move into acceptance, where you gain a sense of relief and willingness to move forward and without the person in your life, and you start realizing that even though maybe you realize that there's a major loss, you realize that you're absolutely going to be okay, the kids are going to be okay, and you start establishing a new sense of who you are without this person, and that you're going to be okay. So, and the way this works is it's not always sequentially. So some people can start with 2 or 1 in any order, but generally speaking, this is the order that things happen. But you can certainly experience 2 at a time, 3 at a time, 1 at a time, and go back and forth until you finally reach acceptance. Sometimes denial looks like acceptance. in the beginning when somebody just seems to be handling things very well, but really they're often truly just in denial. Because then you'll see them later going through this process, and maybe it doesn't start until after somebody signs the dotted line and they're actually divorced. And some people will, after they, the divorce process, it can last for some people. I've been involved in cases where it's several years, and they often return to these symptoms. So first, when the person leaves, and then secondly, after they've signed the dotted line and they get the email with the document after they've been to court, they get the final judgment, and they go through these things again, but often it's much quicker. All right, so as stated above, divorce has other challenges and does not necessarily follow the Kubler-Ross model. So divorce, like losing someone to death, does include the process of emotional upheaval, chaos, behavioral change, and then adjustment. However, the process of divorce has its own nuances. Based on my experience working with thousands of divorcing and divorced people, I would suggest combining Bonahan's and Hagemeyer's stages of divorce to best illustrate the stepwise challenges that a divorcing person passes through as they begin to transform from their married self to their new independent self. Please note also that individuals often go through these stages at different times during the process, may revisit stages at later times, not experience one, or experience multiple at once. These stages are the process that most people follow. So let's look at Paul Bonahan's model of divorce. So the first thing that occurs is the emotional divorce, and you'll see that there's some similarities here with Kubler-Ross's model, but they're just a little more in depth. So the emotional divorce occurs. So you begin to emotionally separate from the other spouse. Often this occurs for one person before the other person is aware. So this is where, again, one person is blindsided by the other, and the blindsided person can't believe how far away the other person is so suddenly. But that other person was divorcing from the relationship sometimes years before they say they don't want to be married anymore. But eventually both people go through an emotional divorce. And then you have the legal divorce. This is the lawful end of the marriage by court action. So despite this occurring often early in the process, this is only the beginning of one's journey toward total divorce. So the research talks about once there is the legal divorce where the paperwork is signed, it takes 6 months to 2 years for family members to adjust, so meaning the children and the parents. So it takes about sometimes up to 2 years before life comes back together for the family, despite being apart and separate. But the legal divorce certainly can begin pretty quickly as soon as court actions start occurring. So, and then it ends with the final judgment. But of course, for some families, that legal divorce just continues on, never allowing for the processing and for the end of this stage. And then number 3, we have economic divorce. This is you have two households, no longer one household. One of you may have returned to work and the other may be working more. But you are both likely learning to live differently now that it costs more money to run two households. And once you have your footing, you move beyond this stage. And this is a real challenge because even though somebody felt really emotional and really strong about getting divorced, when they hit this phase, they realize that there are major economic impacts for most people when there's divorce. Because again, there's two houses and not just one. And sometimes college savings get spent. Sometimes there were no college savings in the beginning. Kids really miss out. And they miss out because their parents are working more, and they miss out on being able to do things where two parents are able, that are living together, that are able to provide a lot of capital to the children. And then we move into the co-parental divorce. This is where the parents are now negotiating joint parenting decisions, and they're each determining their roles as parents, possibly letting go of old roles and adding new ones, and spending less or more time with their children. and then learning to hopefully be a successful parent in a binuclear family. So this is where the kids start adapting, parents start adapting, and you start realizing too you can't work as much because you got to be home taking care of the kid. And now there's two people, and often both parents now want to be involved. Like for example, so in many traditional families where the dad always worked and was not at appointments, the doctor's office, healthcare appointments at the or at the school, and now that because of the divorce, that parent seems to feel like they really need to be involved. So those things happen. So those are changes too, and also the loss of the old freedoms, and certainly there are new freedoms that come with more involvement. But let's move on to community divorce. So this is the changes that occur with relationships and friends. So as the divorce continues, parents may receive less support from family and friends, as you may no longer feel comfortable being around certain married friends or around mutual friends of your past spouses. And you may begin to feel the push to date also, but you're likely very anxious about it. So it's like you're coming out and back out into the community, and this is a tough part because people start wondering who really were their friends, who was their friends. And often because friends go to different sides, or if it's a high conflict divorce, they often get away from both parties. And then often in marriages that last a long time, in-laws had been very close, and now people lose even the in-laws that were once friends, the former in-laws. And then finally we move to the psychic or the psychological divorce. And here at this stage, this is where, in this state, so all the other stages have resolved, and you have finally gained more comfort around all those areas, and you're moving toward independence, and you're self-supportive, and you gain more insight as to why the marriage failed, and you realize that it was probably for the best, so there's great acceptance, and you spend less time in regret or blaming the other or yourself, and spend more time learning about yourself and adapting to the single life and possibly the dating world. Now let's look at one other model. This is the third model, Stanley Hagemeyer's Psychosocial Phases of Divorce, 1986. So in his model, he offers two additional psychosocial phases or crises that occur which need to be eventually resolved during the divorce process. Hagemeyer's stages are evident in my clinical practice when working with divorcing families in therapy, in terms of what I see as being the most devastating. So these phases are loss of dreams and loss of physical accessibility. So the first one, loss of dreams. So the loss of the dream of the marriage and having that partner is felt. The loss of one's expectations of the marital bliss that one believed that they had, and the loss of the idea of raising children together, retiring, traveling, and spending time with grandchildren. So everything that the person thought that would be has now been smashed, and this is what is so devastating. And it becomes ever more devastating, or even more devastating, when the marriage ends, or when someone realizes that it's going to be over and they've moved out of that shock phase. And the peculiar thing, as the psychologist, but not peculiar anymore, but I guess maybe to family or friend, is that even if the relationship was not so good, right, the person will still have this loss of dreams where they're just devastated. They can't believe that it's over, and they were supposed to, walk hand in hand, be in the bathtubs like the separate bathtubs like Cialis, looking at the sunset or looking down the valley or staring at the ocean together, despite the relationship being not so rewarding. So there's loss of dreams no matter if the relationship was healthy, good, or really positive. And then loss of physical accessibility. So as the divorce process begins, one partner is no longer there for the other physically, emotionally, or sexually. So this person is alone. I mean, they're afraid to be alone. They're afraid to be home. Going to work, they don't want to go home because they're going to be alone. They feel like they have nothing to share, or things don't really become memories or important until they are sharing things with their partner. So feel like they have nobody to share the stuff to. So their life is kind of hopeless at times in the beginning. So also the relationships and resources attached to the other person are also removed. This loss is sensed regardless of one's feeling of attachment to the other partner. So again, loss of in-laws, loss of friends, loss of different social clubs and associations, and you're just alone. You're out there on your own. So please note that I do find Hagemeier's crises to be the most devastating and emotional and emotion generating when the divorce process begins, especially if one partner was unaware that the other has been planning for a divorce for an extended period of time, and the news of wanting a divorce was brought about without warning. So the takeaway here is from this section is to realize, it's to reflect about the stages that you've gone through, and hopefully to help move you to that psychological divorce where you are now creating your own self-identity as a single person, or even a person in a new relationship, and a binuclear family where there's meaning about being apart, and there's meaning in your new life, and there's a sense that your life is better today and things all worked out for some purpose in terms of being apart, and everybody's better off. So the hope is to get to that. Certainly that sentiment is not perfect or pure, but because often people, even though they're satisfied where they end up being after divorce, some of them, even people that are happy currently, still reflect and wish they could have worked things out with their former partner, so the children would have had an intact original family. Section 3 exercise. So the aim is to move through these stages and to reach a psychic or a psychological divorce where you are now independent and have created a new, healthy self-identity apart from your former spouse or partner. What is your current stage based upon the model that applies to you best? And how can you begin to move to the next stage and final stage if you are not there already?